Hello, this is HPI Frank from HPI Racing, and today we're going to be building the Venture SBK Scale Builder Kit. Now, obviously, you're going to need the kit, and we've got a bunch of the HPI Pro Series tools here that you're going to be needing. Of course, you can use whatever tools that you've got. We've got some HPI thread lock, and if you're going to be driving in wet conditions, you'd probably be best off using your favorite waterproof grease. So the first thing we're going to do is have a look at what's inside the box. So we're just going to move everything out of the way. And inside the box we've got all of the parts bags nicely laid out according to the step of the kit that you're going to be building. Here are all of the parts bags that you'll be getting to, again, in the order that you'll be building. Obviously, A, B, C, all the way to H. Here's the chassis rails in their own separate bag. The first thing you should look at is, of course, the assembly manual. Now, this will tell you exactly what parts and tools that you'll need to build it with. Again, you're going to need grease, thread lock, and shock oil. And you're going to need a 1.5, a 2.0, a 2.0 ball end would be helpful, and a 2.5 millimeter wrench, ball end wrench, and needle nose pliers and a cross wrench, all helpful tools to have in your RC kit. And to get driving, of course, you're going to need all your electronics, charger, batteries, etc. So we're not going to be installing that as we go along. I'm going to leave that to you to decide what you're going to be installing. So we've got everything laid out. But before we continue, let's just have a look at what else we've got in here. We've got the warranty instructions, very important. Handy sticker sheet for adding to your scalar truck body. And a MyHPI registration card. So remember to go onto MyHPI, my.hpiracing.com, and fill in your details if you haven't already, and add the Venture to your HPI garage. So the first steps are to assemble the diffs, and that is bag A. So that will take us up through building the steering assembly and universals. And looks like at least the front axle and the steering for the front axle. So we're starting with the front end. So let's just get going. I'm going to move everything else out of the way. So here we've got bag A. Nice that we've got some spare hardware. It's pretty handy. So here's the bag with the front universals. It's an option part included with the SBK. Here's all your aluminum parts for the front end. The brass axle weights, another handy HPI option part included. There's your locked gear diff, steering parts, and the plastic axle pieces and steering pieces. Okay, so step one is going to be assembling the diff lockers. So we've got all the parts from the diff bag, or the diff lock bag from bag A. So all of those are there, and we're just going to put them all together. Now I put down an extra sheet of paper here and some plastic underneath to just protect the rest of the table from grease. And the grease I'm going to be using is just the standard heavy-duty grease from HPI. So there's a brand new tube, so just got to puncture it. And the first thing we're going to do is, you see here on the instructions, everywhere where there is a shaded bit, like there, and this, the pinion gear, or the ring gear, sorry, and this piece here, all of those need to have just a coating of grease on them, is all they need. So we're just going to very quickly do that. Doesn't need to be a heavy coating of grease, just a little bit. So what I like to do is basically literally assemble the pieces of each car just facing the same way, so I'm making sure to do it exactly the way the kit designers have intended. So with that in place, we're going to get our thread locker. This is the HPI stuff. You can use, of course, any brand you wish. And we're going to get the 2mm, sorry, that's a 1.5. And just a little bit of thread lock on there. And we're just going to make sure that that lines up. And we're going to screw that in just a bit until it bites at the very bottom. And then we're going to do the same through for the remainder of the screws. Now it's not super critical on this particular one, but you'll notice that I'm putting this screw in first and then this one, and then either one of the other screws that are left, and then the final screw. So this is what's called the star pattern. So it's similar how you would tighten the lug nuts on a full-size car. So it's not super critical for this particular item, but it's just a good habit to get into when you're assembling. Okay, so with all of these installed now, we've got the small bearings, or no, sorry, the big bearings are going to go on these pieces here. And these are the 8x14 bearings. And just give it a little bit of a spin, just make sure it's all nice and smooth. Oops. And then we've got the pinion gear shaft. Now, if I'm not calling these exactly by the name that they're given in the instructions, don't worry about that. This is the input gear. And this one has a very small E-ring, E-clip that goes on the end. So if you have an E-clip tool, you can use that, or you can just use a big pair of pliers. And these gears need just a light coating of grease to go on them. Not a huge amount, again. And they just need to go on the teeth. So as these spin around inside the axle, they will get coated in the grease. So you don't have to do every single bit. So the next step, step 4, is assembling the universal drive shafts. Of course, we need to make sure that the input shaft bearings go on. There we go. You see why this gets messy pretty quickly. So we're going to use, just in case this drips out anymore, I'm going to use the excess plastic bag there. Okay, so what we've got here is the retainer goes on the outside of the where the wheel and the hex are going to go, basically. And then we've got the actual drive shaft and the cross piece that goes there. That's going to need some grease. Just checking making sure everything is we're understanding where everything goes. So just going to put some grease on the inside of this piece here. And then the cross piece. Just wipe off the excess. So that's in there, and we're lining up the hole. Not sure if you can see that. And then we're putting the pin in place. Also, the ball of the universal needs to be greased, so we'll do that. Make sure we're following all the steps properly. So again, just a light coating. And then put the retainer over the cross pin, and there we are. So that's one done, quite easy. So that's the first universal done, and just going to go straight into doing the second. Now that we know exactly how it goes together. Pretty simple. And there we go. Quick as that. So that's step 4 done. Step 5. Is opening, looks like this bag here. So we've got the axle weights and the aluminum parts that we're not going to get into just yet. We've got a bunch of hardware. Now for the hardware, just to make sure it doesn't go anywhere, we're going to use this magnetic parts tray, which is very handy. So we'll just keep this stuff off to the side. We will need to get into this because that has the steering arms in it. So it looks like just those pieces for now. And we're going to need to get into this bag as well. So we're just going to keep the axle pieces together. And we need the uprights. Okay, and again, we're just gonna, just for ease of assembly, we're gonna align them the same way they are pictured in the assembly manual. So go there. Bearings go in. And we've got these button head screws, the 10 mil ones. Now, if you ever are in doubt or you don't have a pair of calipers or ruler handy, you can always just line up the screw right next to the full-size picture just to make sure you're using the right length screw. And you're even told which hex size screw or hex size driver to use right there. So again, you can use the HPI Pro Series tools or whichever tools that you've got. We've also got this handy cordless screwdriver, and that has a 2.0 bit in it. So it makes things much quicker, a little noisier, but much quicker. So we're just going to use this. Now when you're using these, make sure you set the clutch. This one goes quite high, so almost like a drill, because you don't want to set the strip out the plastic pieces. So you can hear that clutch engage, and that's protecting the plastic. So don't worry about it if you hear that noise. So on this one, make sure, on the left side one, make sure that you line it up properly. I suppose there's no way to get it backwards. So we're just putting in the first one part way and then do the second, so the screws sort of lock each other in place. And then give it a good hold so it doesn't spin out of your hand. There you go. So that is step 5 complete. Step 6 is the steering link. So these pieces are used in step 7. So make sure and set those aside. So these should be pretty easy to twist on by hand. You shouldn't need a separate tool for these. I'm just taking my time to make sure it's nice and straight as it goes on. So this will take a little bit of feel maybe, just before you start really cranking on it. But once you've got it on, you can get one of your hand tools and just use it sort of like a T-handle. And there we go. So note that when you're attaching these, that the manual suggests or tells you that these need to be at a bit of an angle. So I think we've got that pretty much on. So now we're just going to do the other side. Now this isn't a turnbuckle, so you don't need to worry about getting the direction of the twisting correct. Just righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. So and on this side, again, same as the other side, needs to be a little bit of an angle. There's no number given, but it looks like about 15, maybe 20 degrees or something like that. So if we're looking on the one that we've just attached, so it's pretty close. Now, as long as you're looking at it end on like that, and the bits where the rod ends are going to go, or the ball ends, those are, as long as they're pretty close to flat, you'll be okay. So these need a little bit of a tweak, just to make sure that they're nice and even. So it's pretty close. They don't need to be exact, but just pretty close. All right, so on to step 7. And there's a bunch of parts going together here. So what we need are, let's do the right side first. So we're going to put and I made the mistake already of installing this backwards. But that's what power tools are for. So extra points to you if you spotted that in, what was it, step 5. Okay, so we've got a universal. It's going to be going into the C-hub. And then around that is going to be going the correct side of the knuckle. So you'll notice that this little nub here is meant to be facing up, and that is this piece here. And there's also an R handily noted on the actual piece. So we're doing the right side, we've got the nub, and we've got the correct letter. So we're going to put that one aside, and that's the left side. That's the left side pieces there. But first, before we put this in, we need to put in the little flange bushings. The flange bushings are in the aluminum parts bag. So there's 4. So the flange bushings are these little guys. Some people call them top hats because they're a little bit top hat shaped. Stovepipe hat. So those need to go in. Probably it's easiest to put them in before you put in the universal. And those just get pushed up inside. And what these do is prevent the plastic parts from rubbing on each other. So now you've got, that's your steering right there. So now we need 2 more 10 mil length screws, and those are going to be going into the steering knuckle. Now if you're using power tools, that's probably a little bit too tight, so you just want to make sure, just back them off maybe a quarter turn, and so you have easy free movement. All right, and we're going to do the wheel hexes at the same time. So the cross pin goes in and immediately falls out. So the cross pin goes in, and we're just going to turn the axle, the drive shaft, so the cross pin's horizontal, so it doesn't immediately fall out. And then we're going to get our 1.5 hex wrench and just put a dab, just a very small amount of thread lock. Probably can't even see that, on the screw threads, and just put in just a couple threads. You don't need too many because we're just holding it in place at the moment. And then just make sure and pull the threads through on this side here of the axle, and then just tighten it down. So there you go. And then, so that's the right side drive shaft installed now. And we're going to do the left side just the same way, but just slightly different parts. Now when you're putting this in, make sure that that little nub is at the top, and just to double check, make sure that you can see the L on the left side steering knuckle. And again, get the hand tool and just take it back a quarter inch or a quarter turn, so you have some movement, easy movement. And hand tighten the 1.5 grub screw, and then that's it for the left and right sides, all done. They go together exactly the same way, so pretty simple there. Next step, step 8. So this is where we get the big pieces of the axles out, and that piece, which we'll get to in a little bit. So the first thing we do is we're going to, again, arrange the parts. It's not super critical, but again, a good habit to get into. Just lay out the parts the same way they are in the manual, so you don't miss too much, or anything, hopefully. We're going to get the axle weights out. More options going into the Venture. So axle weights going in, and we've got the input gear. I'm going to take that gear off. This was just so we don't lose it. I'm going to put this gear right there, and then the pinion, or the other gear that we just removed, we're just going to put it in through this side like that. Axle weights there. The grease is already on the gears, but we're going to put a little bit more on. it doesn't need to go on every single tooth, but it because it will get spread around as the gears rotate. So now you can see that those are nicely getting spread out. So just put a little bit more just to make sure. And there we go. Now, it's again worth mentioning at this point, if you're going to be driving in wet or very dusty conditions, we don't know where you're going to be driving your Venture, but just in case, if you're going to be driving it in really harsh conditions, just an edge of grease on all these seams around here, and also on either side of the bearings at the ends of the axles and also at the input shafts. That'll just keep water and dust from getting inside and wearing away at the gears and possibly rusting anything. So again, just use whichever grease that you're using. Automotive grease or your favorite brand of RC specific grease is fine. So that is step 8 complete. Actually, no, we need to put some screws into these holes here. Should have done that first. It made it this bit a little easier because now we have to hold the pieces in place. I think these are... So these 10 mil screws that are going in, they will space out the axle weights. So make sure that the axle weights aren't in the way of the screws as they come through the plastic. Okay, and now that is step 8 complete. Step 9 is the other half of the axle. So here's the front link piece that goes on the front there. Link ball goes in here. This is where you can use a pair of pliers to gently squeeze it in, like that. And the front diff cover. This is another piece where if you're going to be greasing the axles, make sure and get the grease inside there. Now for the screws that go into the diff cover, there are 2 different lengths. So make sure you put them in the right positions. The longer screws, the 25 mil length screws, go on top, and the shorter screws go on the bottom. Okay, so unfortunately, we don't have a 1.5 mil tool tip for the cordless screwdriver, so these are just going to go in by hand. So that's the first one done. Tighten, but not tighten all the way down. And again, we're going to do the star pattern. So we're going to do the top middle one, and then this one, then this one, and then this one, and this one, and then the last one. Okay, so that is all 6 of the screws tightened nicely. And not over tightened, because otherwise you'll strip out all the plastic threads that are in there. All right, so the next step is step 10, and this is where we start to add the aluminum shock mounts and panhard bar mounts. So let's get those out. Those are right here. So we're going to start again with the axle aligned the same way it is in the manual, and we're going to get not this piece, that's for the panhard mount, and that's the bottom piece. So we're going to get these 2 pieces and just line those up here. And there. And those press together, and they will tie the ends of the axles together so that the seams are nice and closed. See, from here and there. So again, we've got the M3x10 screws. So these, because they're going into metal, they're going to need thread lock. Go. Nice and tight. Now make sure you're screwing in from the top as well, not from the bottom. And for the other side, make sure that the panhard bar link mount is facing the inside of the axle. And that's step 10 complete. So step 11 is we're going to be inserting and installing all of these, the drive shaft pieces and everything. So the first thing we need to do is just coat the square section of the drive shaft with some grease. Need the bearing in there. And again, this is another bearing. If you're going to be driving in wet conditions, coat that on both sides with some good waterproof grease. Now you'll have to spin the drive shaft just a bit to get it to engage that square section to fit into the diff locker. Once you've done that, just press it down, and you'll have these holes line up nicely there. So these are the M6 screws. So these we're going to put in by hand because they're quite short, and we want to make sure that we don't strip out those screws, the plastic screw holes. Make sure that they're aligned completely first. And there we go. All right, and the next one, same thing, grease. Now you could skip this step by making sure that the hole in the diff locker's greased ahead of time when you put in the diff lock installed in the axle, but either way is fine. So just make sure you don't install it upside down like this. You want to make sure that this piece here is facing up. And what that does is it allows the end of the shock to give it enough space to pivot. So we're going to pull this down with 2 fingers. Make sure that the holes line up. And then hand tighten. Okay, give it a good twist, make sure everything is turning as it should, and that's step 11 done. Okay, for step 12, we are going to be installing the steering drag link, which we made previously. First of all, attaching these steering flange balls. Oops. And then note that it's easiest to look at this from the side. So this way, being the front of the truck, you see how the rod ends are angled, and they will be fitted under on the bottom of the steering plates. So we'll just get these attached by hand first. So nothing falls off and we can get a better idea of how this is going to attach. So there we go. So you see, that's the front end. The drag link is underneath the anodized aluminum parts, and the angle of the drag link is up like that. It's quite exaggerated, but you can see how it's up like that. So it gives space for the universal. It's going to have space clearance for the universal. Okay. So now we're just going to get the 5.5 mil box wrench and just tighten everything down. Okay. So now that is ready to go, and that is step 12 complete. All right, so bag B has mostly the same parts as bag A, which mainly it just doesn't have the steering pieces. So we've got the plastic axle pieces, and there's the drive shaft. All the metal pieces are in this. So the drive shafts, the shock mounts, and the axle weights. And then there's the diff, ring and pinion gear, and the diff lock. Okay, step 14 is building the diff gears exactly the same way as we did the front end. So once again, we're going to put a bit of grease and then we've got the 1.5 mil. So we can't use the power driver. See, we're again using the star method. If you just do that on everything that you're installing, you'll never forget. Okay, and the big gears again, once again going on the ends. And then step 15 is the pinion gear. With the E-clip. And then one of the gear bearings going on that. Step 16. Now these are the axle lockouts, so it basically replaces all the steering plastic pieces. So we've got this one going in first, and then the outer bearing, and the what I was going to do with this was put the grease in the holes, like I mentioned for the front end. Just going to do that now, make it slightly neater. And then we're going to put lots of grease on the ring gear. So you can see, so we haven't put any on the pinion gear, on the input gear. So as you spin that, it gets nicely coated around. Now we're going to open this bag here to get the axle weights. There's our straight drive shafts, shock mounts, and diff cover and hex. So we've got the axle weights here. And those go there. We've got the 10 mil long screws again that go into the tops. And that's step 16 complete. 17 is getting the diff cover in place. So we've got the front of the axle half, and the diff cover, and then the 4-link mount, sorry, goes this way. I was trying to put it backwards. So if this is the front of the truck going in that direction, the 4-link mount goes there. I was just trying to mount it like that, but don't do that. Okay, so we've got, again, we've got the 6 screws. 3 are 25 mil long and 3 are 20 mil long. So the short ones go on the bottom, long ones go on the top. So once again, we're going to attach these in this order. So we're going to start with the top middle, and then the bottom right one. This is the star pattern, remember. And then bottom left, top right, bottom middle, and top left. And we're going by hand so we don't strip out the plastic. Okay, so that's all of the diff cover screws in place. And to make sure you didn't put them in the wrong places or anything, you can check the back side of the axle pieces to make sure that the screws aren't sticking out. Okay, so that is step 17 done. We're going to move on to step 18. Okay, so step 18 is installing the left and right link and shock mounts. So note that there are these square sections in the plastic pieces, and into those sections fit these the square sections on the metal pieces. So those are there to make sure that everything is aligned properly, so that when it's installed, you shouldn't see when you try to put in the screws, you shouldn't see anything in the gap there. If you can see a little bit like that, then it's not installed straight. So just make sure that those are installed properly, and the mount, the sort of the ears for the mount face to the outside where the wheels would be. And we're going to get some thread lock on the screws, just on the tips, just on the ends of the screws on the threads themselves. And we'll just get that started. Get the second one in. Notice we're not using a huge amount of thread locker. Just enough to coat the threads at the end of the screw. Okay, so there we are. And now for the other side, same thing. Make sure that you can't see those flat pieces, just like that. Now if you can't screw it all the way down, that means it's not aligned properly. There's a bit too much on that one. There we go. That's step 18 done. Okay, so we've got the plastic lockouts here, and it's worth noting that this little section that's cut out on top, that needs to be on the top side of the axles. You see that's the bottom and that's the top. So we're going to put the axles, or the bearings in this first, and just press them into place using the axles, just like that. Actually, no, we need to put the axles in anyway. And again, if you're greasing the transmission and everything, the drivetrain, you're going to want to put grease on the insides of these axles and on the outside. Okay, so remember that we greased the diff lockers already on the inside, so all we have to do is, when we're installing these, make sure that the little cutout is facing the top side of the axle, and just as you're pushing this in, just give the axle itself a spin to make sure that it's in place, getting locked in place in that diff locker that's inside there. And again, same thing for the other side. As you're pushing it in, it may already, yep, magically it already was in the correct position. Okay, next step is just installing the very short screws. And to do that, we're going to again do it by hand, not the power driver, because these are very short screws and we don't want them to strip out the plastic, which would mean if they do get stripped out, you'll need to get new axle pieces with fresh plastic Okay. And again, just make sure the holes are lined up nicely. So you don't stretch out the holes. And as soon as you start to feel or see the head of the screw get very, very close to the plastic, just slow down until you start to feel the resistance. And the final thing to do for step 19 is to put the hex hubs on. So we've got the little metal cross pieces. And the hexes slide right over those. Might need a little help pressing them in place. And then we've got our 1.5 mil grub screw. Just the tiny bit of thread lock to hold that in place on the axle. And there we go. That's the front and rear axles complete. Okay, so next step, bag C. We've got the aluminum links for everything. Steering links and panhard link, I believe that is. Got rod ends for the links. All of the hardware to attach the rod ends to the aluminum links. Then here's the pivot balls. Okay, so using our 1.5 mil wrench, just gonna move aside the grease and everything and the thread lock because you don't need it for this step. So we've got our 1.5. We've got a bunch of grub screws and a straight pivot ball, or no, it's a long pivot ball. And then some shorter pivot balls. And then here are all the aluminum links, and they're marked by length. So make sure you there are some angled rod ends, so make sure that those are put in the correct positions on the correct links. And there's our plastic links or rod ends. Okay, so we've got some couple of long angled ones and all the rest of them quite short. And here's the steel links. Okay, so let's do these two first so they're out of the way. So this is basically a lot of screwing the links in. So one thing you could do, you don't have to screw them all in all the way, just about halfway, because you want them to go half into the plastic and half into the aluminum or steel, whichever one. I suppose they're all aluminum. Okay, so about that long. These are 14 mil long grub screws, so about 7 millimeters should be left showing. So once you have done all of them, there's 13 that you need to do, and we're just going to go straight through. And the next step is to put these into the links. So a quick way to get these all coated nicely with the thread lock is to just put the thread lock on one of the discarded plastic bags that we've got, and just because we've got a bunch of these to do, and we're just going to go right into step 22 and just start installing these into the onto the links, and then we'll put the pivot balls in the links, in the rod ends themselves. Okay, so we've got 2 of these that need the angled rod ends, so those are the 82 mil length ones, and those are these. So if you want to be really pro, you can have these so that the logos and the lengths show. Depends whatever you want to do. So we're going to try and have it so that the angles show. See how it works out. Because these are plastic rod ends, you can always just insert them a bit further into the plastic. It just kind of depends how the angles work out, how the lengths of the rods work out, I mean. Now a word on the thread lock. You'll notice that we're using the red thread lock. You can use blue if you want. We're just using the red. It's a bit stronger. Not every use will require it. So it's up to you. Okay, so we'll see how this works out. They will have to be tweaked a little bit, so it's not a big deal. Now the rest of these, there are 4 more links, and there should be 8 more rod ends. Okay, so that is step 22, but we need to get the pivot balls into these rod ends. So first one to do is this one here. It's obviously quite a bit darker than the others, and there's no markings on it, so it's very easy to spot. It's also got this angled end. So that requires, let's see here, that requires one of the, not the special looking one, but one of the normal looking ones that we've got. So if you look very, very closely, usually one side of the rod end has a bit more flash on it. It just looks a bit different. And what you can do is you can use needle nose to do this. You don't have to use a big sucker like this, but you just press it in gently and just make sure it wiggles so that you have enough space for it to, so it's not binding, basically. That's what you want. So try and demonstrate. You can see that this side here on the right has a little bit of flashing, or the edges of the mold seams on it, and this side doesn't. So the rod ends usually have a side that's just slightly easier to press in, so you don't deform the plastic very much or at all. So you just press it in, and with this big sucker you don't need a big pair of pliers to do it, but it's just easier if you have something with a longer handle. Just a bit less force required. So this is quite a quick step. Okay, so that is everything done. We've got the two short ones with the angled pieces at one end, the one with the darker link with just the single rod end, and then the four that I believe are going to go on the back. And then, so that is step 22 complete. The next step is 23, of course, and we've got 4 more rod ends and 2 more links. So we've got just to install these. Now these are a little bit more difficult than the other links because these are solid and already just have to get these on there. And hold them nice and firm. So these aren't needle nose pliers, but they are a bit easier because of the longer handles. You can just hold them steady. And we continue to hold it. And once you get down towards the end, make sure that they're lined up so that they're pretty close to flat, because you'll be putting just so that they line up properly. These are for the steering and panhard links, I believe. Yes. So there we go. Plenty of give. So the short one is for the panhard. This is the steering link that goes from the servo to that left knuckle. Now, if you really wanted to make sure that your steel links are not going to have any scratches on them whatsoever, these have very minimal marks on them with the tool that we're using here, but you can get plastic coated pliers, or pliers I should say, with plastic coated jaws that should eliminate marks on metal things. Or just wrap a t-shirt, an old t-shirt around, around the jaws of the pliers, or the piece itself. This last one is being just a little difficult to get on, but once you start to thread, it should get going okay. Okay, so the steering link is the piece that gets the weird looking, or the slightly different looking rod end or pivot ball. So just going to make sure it goes through and just carefully wiggle it into place. And that way you're not damaging, the very important thing is to not damage the actual round part of the pivot ball. Okay, so that is step 23 done. Okay, for bag D, this involves the transmission and everything, so we're just going to move all the suspension and link stuff and axles out of the way, because we're not going to need them just for a little while. So let's get this opened. So we've got some, that's the servo saver hardware. That is the main drive gear and some hardware. Some more ball bearings, drive shafts, gear shafts and stuff. And these are the transfer case gears. And then we've got some plastic parts. These are the front braces, the receiver box and speed controller shelf, and the transmission case. And we've got the slipper clutch and the rest of the transmission gear internals and externals. So for step 25, we're not going to need a lot of these just yet, so we're going to put those up out of the way. And I'm going to break open this bag here, the smallest bag with the gears in it. So these are the pieces of the slipper clutch and slipper pads. And there we are. Then we've got the main drive gear. We're going to need that. Pinion gear. Not yet. That's for when you install the motor, which again, we're not going to be doing just yet in this video, because we're going to let you guys decide what motor and everything that you guys want. So I'm not sure we're going to need these bits of hardware just yet, but we'll leave them right there. Okay, so now this step is what we need these types of pliers. These are called channel locks, or the various names, but these are big honking pliers that you can adjust and really squeeze down. This is for the slipper clutch spring. So you can use a small model vise or normal size vise if you wanted, but we're going to see how it goes with those there. So first thing we're going to need is this shaft. Now again, we're going to line it up with the parts drawing. The small pin there, and looks like we are going to need this here. So that goes at the end. Just pour these out. Maybe we don't. Okay, so this pin goes down there. We've got the big gear. Okay, we've got this plate, the smooth slipper pad, slipper plate I should say, and then the slipper pad, then the gear, the other slipper pad, the other smooth metal plate, and then this plate, and then the pin, bearing goes over that obviously, then the screw, the nut, and the output drive cup. Okay, so in order, here's what we've got in order. So you can see where the pin goes into the slipper, I'm not sure what we're calling those, but the slipper pieces there, the aluminum slipper pieces. So that's the order that it goes into. And we're just putting them on basically just in order. Make sure that there's little teeth inside this gear. So these green pads lock into those the teeth. Be able to see it easier on the other side. because the teeth are a bit bigger, but on this side, probably easiest to push it down like that. Now you can really see those teeth, and the pad just locks into place around those teeth there. And the smooth pad actually might have been easier to put the, yeah, probably. Because the aluminum piece has to fit over that. Okay, so the very small pin goes in, and then the smooth metal pad, and then this piece, see that the pin has to go into the cross open areas there. Let's see if we can get this lined up. Like so. Still have to give it a little wiggle to make sure everything is locked into place. So just give that a good turn. It looks like we've got a good connection there. So now these are all locked in place. So now you can kind of wiggle it around and not worry about it. Now the bearing, and now the spring. And then thread this on. And between, you see the instructions here, the factory setting, 1.5 or 1.60 millimeters. So unless you have a pair of calipers, that's going to be quite difficult to figure out. But one way to get that is to get a 1.5 mil wrench of any kind and just fit the flat pieces in between until it tightens down, and you can't wiggle it back and forth, and then just loosen it very slightly until you can fit maybe a piece of paper through there, just, or a slip of paper, or one of these plastic bags. So that should be about what you need, and you can always tighten it down because it is an externally adjustable slipper clutch, which is handy. So now we're just going to put the cross pin, the screw shaft as it's called, we're going to put that on the hex wrench and then just coat the, we don't want this coming out, so we want a little bit more than we've been using, the red thread lock on there. Okay, so we've got the screw shaft. We put some of the strong red thread lock on it. And now it's important to note on this, on the diff output cup, only one side is threaded. So make sure that you're going to be putting the screw shaft through the side that's threaded. So line up the holes, and of course, because the slipper spring needs to be compressed, it's going to be, you're not going to be able to see the complete, it's not going to be a complete circle. And then put it in your pipe wrench or vise or whatever you've got. Make sure the holes are aligned. And then you're really going to have to crank down on the, well, on the spring, on the pliers, But once you've got it partially in, you know you're set. There we go. And now just hold that down. And then once the shaft is in there, the screw shaft is in there, you can should be able to just tighten it down as normal. So there we are. It's all the way in. Okay. And now at this point, triple check that you put all the parts in the right order, because just want to make sure. Okay, right. Oh, and this spacer piece, just go ahead and put that there so you don't lose it. Step 26. Right, so we're going to need the motor plate and a couple of the plastic pieces. Okay, so we're going to need that one. And that piece there. And again, easiest thing to do is to just line up everything the way it looks in the instructions. Okay, so we've got the main drive gear. Now this is the same drive gear that comes in the Savage XS Flux, and there is an optional gearing that you can get because of it's basically high-speed gearing that you can get, just getting the optional gear for that. So we've got the gear shaft on and the gear mounted on the bearings, so it spins nice and free. And then we're putting this. There we are. Putting this cover so you can see where the slipper shaft is going to be going there. I'm going to flip it over, and we've got two 3x10 screws that are going to go on either side of the bottom holes. Okay, and now we've got the servo mount and front brace. So again, just making sure everything's all lined up properly. Goes like that. So we have a 15 mil screw. So we've got two longer screws in the hardware pack. So we've got the 15 mil and the 18 mil. 15 mil goes in from the brace side. And then the 18 mil goes in from the transmission side. Okay, so that's step 26 and 27 done. 28 is, we've got the spacer, make sure it goes on, and then a ball bearing on the end of the slipper shaft. We forgot to put the grease on the gears. So now we can make sure and put it, this is where the pinion would be connecting, so it's quite easy to access this section. And then for the other smaller gear, we can make sure that there's plenty of grease that goes on these teeth. There we go. And make sure it spins nice and smooth. And then we've got the last piece of the transmission plastics. Well, second to last piece, actually. Now again, this is another place, the bearings and the seams around the transmission. You're going to want to waterproof those with some good waterproof grease if you're going to be driving in really wet or super dusty conditions. So we've got 2 8mm screws and 3 8mm screws and 2 okay. So there's 3 8mm screws and then the 2 10mm screws that we need. And again, you can measure those on the actual instructions themselves to make sure. But so this bottom one needs 10mm, and then this one across from it needs a 10mm, and these 3 need 8mm screws. So just a quick blast with the driver. And there we go. There's a transmission ready to go. Make sure it spins nice and smooth. All right, so the next bit is the receiver box and speed controller shelf. So we're going to set these aside just very quickly. And we have some pieces just to install here. Now this is completely optional, definitely, especially if you're going to be changing the position of the speed controller and receiver. So, but we're just building this according to the instructions. But this is definitely an optional step. So we're going to put the antenna to that hole there, and we've got a grub screw that will hold it in place. Now the great thing about this receiver box is that with the lid in place, it just takes two very small screws. It's splash proof and pretty much waterproof unless you completely submerge it. The connection is got a nice seal to it. The only place where you might want to put some silicone or thick glue or something like that is around where the wires come out. But this is a great box for receivers that aren't waterproof or for a winch controller or a light controller or something like that. So very, very handy. So now we've got these here all ready to go and just bolt in place onto the motor plate, which is a nice, very solid 3 or 4 mil thick cross member brace for the front end of the chassis. And we've got an 8 mil screw and a 10 mil screw to put in there. So the 8 mil screw goes on this side. And that leaves the 10 mil screw going in here. So there you go. You can see how the drivetrain is starting to come together. And that's step 29. The next few steps, 30 is just making sure your electronics are centered. You want to center your steering servo before you install it. 31 is assembling the servo saver and installing the servo itself into the servo mount area. 32 is installing the motor. Now, we're not doing a motor in this build, but the pinion cover, we can install that, and that is a small screw that holds that in. It is going into metal, but for this instance, we don't need to use the thread lock on it. And of course, this is where you would use the pinion gear and grub screw. And there's also motor mount screws, pretty handy. Step 33, this is where you would install the receiver into the receiver box if you were using it. Again, the cover goes on there. 2-3 screws hold it in place. Right, so that is step 33 done. So now we're on to step 34. I'm going to be opening this bag here. And this is the transfer case, transfer box gears, the other half of the transfer case, and the bearings and hardware and gear shafts for that. All in one step. Okay. So let's start with this case here. Don't know whether to call it left or right side, but again, we're just going with the angling everything the same way as it's angled or presented in the assembly manual. So the first thing is everything gets bearings. The bottom one gets a larger bearing. And once again, if you're going to be driving this in wet or very dusty conditions, make sure you put grease on at least the outside and inside of this big bearing. And before you seal the opposite side of this, put that on. Make sure you put a rim of grease around the edge of the case itself. All right, so we're going to start with this short, well, I suppose it's the, yes, it's the shortest gear shaft. So the first thing we need to do is put the pin in place. Now there are two different lengths of pins in this hardware bag in this particular step. And this step requires the shortest length of pin, because we're going to be installing the smallest gear. So we've got the pin, and then you can see where there's a section for that pin to go in the gear, and it slides right over. And then we've got the smaller of the two E-clips that are included. And then just gently press that into place. Make sure the E-clip doesn't escape. And there we are. So now that is a single piece. So that can fit, that goes into the top. Just like that. Okay. And then for the next longer gear shaft. So when you're assembling the gear shaft that has the two holes in it that will hold the middle-sized gear, it's important to note that there are two sizes of holes. The smaller hole is for the silver cross pin, and that fits in like that. And then the middle-sized gear goes over that like so. And then this hole here actually sticks outside of the gear case so that the threaded shaft, the screw shaft, can fit through that to hold the drive cup in place. Okay, so just something to note. We've got there's only one length of drive pin or cross pins left, so there's two of those. So you can't mix it up. That goes over that. And then the bearing goes over that. Nope, wrong bearing. The smaller of the two bearings. There we go. And that goes in there. So you can see how those interact. Now these require some grease. So it's a little bit easier and neater to put the grease on once the gears are in place. And now we've got the long gear shaft. Now this is going to protrude out of both sides of the case, just like this end will stick out. So first thing is put the pin in, slide that over, and then we've got the large E-clip. Again, make sure it doesn't try to escape anywhere. This one's going to be a little bit more difficult to get in place. So we might use the bigger. There we go. There we are. So now that's in place, and we're going to, because these are quite heavily stressed gears, we're going to make sure that there's plenty of grease on these gear teeth. And then make sure and put this in the correct direction, because otherwise the case won't fit. So like that. And then we've got the last couple of gears to go on, or bearings to go on. We've got this one, and we've got that large one. So for step 35, we're basically just going to put the other half of the transfer case, the plastic transfer case, over the gears. I've already put the bearings inside in this half of the case. So basically, all you have to do is slide it back over. Now again, if you are going to be driving this in harsh environments, you're going to need to put heavyweight grease on both sides of this bearing, and also around the rim of the transfer case. So that is that. And now we've got these 12mm screws that are going to go in place. There's only 3 of them, and those hold the transfer case securely together. And now for the input drive cup. Now there's only one side that has threads in it. There's holes on both sides, but only one side has threads, so make sure that you're putting that in, the screw shaft into the correct side. Don't forget a bit of thread lock on the threads. Not a huge amount. So you should be able to once you get it lined up, you should be able to just push that in with your finger and then tighten it down with a 1.5mm wrench. And there you go. That's the transfer case done. The gears are nicely greased inside. And we can move on to step 36. Step 36 is building the shocks. So that is bag E. And we'll just cut the bag open. So we've got either the front or rear shocks, because they are color coded. You see the green mark there on the springs. And here's the other pair of shocks. These are yellow shocks, yellow springs. Got a bag of with a silicone shock oil in it. And here's the shock shafts and the O-rings and the internals. And here are the externals. So just move a couple of these things out of the way. So we need to fill all the shocks at the same time. So we'll just get them all built at the same time. So make sure you don't lose any of these. There are some spacers and things like that. A lot of round pieces here that can possibly roll away. Here's the shock shafts, which we'll be needing right away. These are going underneath the pistons. The pivot balls you don't need quite yet. O-rings and such we will need. So we don't need this oil yet. Now the shock shafts and the bodies are all the same. So let's get the pistons on first. So there we go. And we need 2 O-rings and a spacer for each one. So we've got the silicone shock oil that's included in the kit. And we just need to put a drop of oil in the shock body. Maybe 2, and then just make sure that's nicely coated inside, and then the first red O-ring, a bit of oil, and then the spacer, and then the other O-ring on top of that. And then we've got these little shock bottoms. They're threaded. So that's all there is to assembling the bottom of the shock. And then you take your assembled shock piston or shock shaft. Best to put a generous drop of oil on the bottom so it doesn't scratch the O-rings. And then push that through gently. Then get your rag and then just pull that through. So that's that for assembling the main body of the shock. So we're going to do that 3 more times. Okay, so there we go. That is the main part of step 37 complete. And now we just need to put some spacers and the shock ends. And there's just 2 spacers for the front. So these are going to be the rear shocks, and these will be the front. So very simply, just slide these over. And now a lot of people have different ways to hold the shock shafts in place. You can get specialist RC tools that have smooth aluminum grips that hold on to the shock shafts. You can use vice grip type pliers, or you can wrap the shock shafts with tape. I like to generally just use tape and then fold it over the shock shaft. Make sure it's nice and free of the oil. If you have to, use some brake cleaner or the HPI nitro car cleaner to remove all the oil from the shock shaft. And then get yourself, again, one of these nice long handled pliers and wrap it over the tape so it protects the shaft. You don't want scratches on the shaft, basically. And then just carefully thread on the shock end. You don't have to put a heroic amount of grip on the shock shaft, just enough to keep it stable. And then once you reach the end of the threads and the bottom of the plastic piece, or the top end in this case, is flush with the straight part of the shock shaft, you're all done. So that's that. So now we just move on to the rest. And you can turn the tape inside out, or use a different section of the tape so that you make sure that the teeth aren't cutting through the tape. So here I'm just using a new piece of tape. Okay, and there we are, all done. That is step 37 complete. So we've got our front shocks and our rear shocks ready to fill with oil. So step 38 is filling the shock bodies themselves with oil. So just to protect the work surface, again, we're going to get another sheet of plastic. This is the plastic bag that the instruction manual came in. And there are various ways that you can use to remove the bubbles. There's machinery you can get. There's little specialized stands that you can get. Sometimes we just like to use old monster truck tires and car wheels. So what we can do is fill up the body with the shock oil and then basically just let it stand in there until the bubbles all disappear. And that's what we're going to do. So with the shock all the way extended, just going to add oil until it gets close to the top, and then just let it rest. This is a bit messy, so you do need to have a rag handy. So with the oil and the air bubbles settled, we can just pull down on the shock shaft to let the bubbles get past the piston. If there are any bubbles, there's a couple there. And then you just pull down quickly, and that will release the bubbles from underneath. Let them escape out. There's a bit more. And then now we will get the shock cap and get one of the black O-rings. Stretch it over the inside so it will seal the oil inside the shock. And then at this point, it doesn't really matter what order you do them in, but push the shock up and then basically get your rag ready, because this will spill out a bit. And it'll run into the threads. So just use a rag to soak up that oil. And then push it in to make sure that the shock can be pushed in, the shock shaft. And that bounce back is what's called rebound. So that's a good amount. You don't have to be super precise with this. It's not a touring car or a racing buggy, but you can get really, really precise if you really want to. but you generally don't have to worry about precise amounts of rebound too much. So again, just pushing the shock shaft up. First we need to get the so that is one of the shocks completely built, basically, except for the other bits that go on, like the shock collars and the bottoms. But we're just going to quickly get through the rest of these and just put the tops on. So there we are. That's the fourth shock assembled. And if you really wanted, you can check the rebound of all of these to make sure that they're even. Those are really pretty close. There's shock spacer there. So those are pretty close. Quite happy with that. And when you're done, you can wipe the shock bodies down with a fresh rag just to make sure that there's nothing left on them. And the shock shafts as well, because that's where the dust and the oil, the dust and the mud are going to collect as you're driving. And this also helps to make sure that everything is nicely tightened up at the top and bottom of the shock body. Okay, so now we can put the cap on the shock oil and carry on. All right, the next step is step 39, and that is installing the springs with the two different shock collars. We've got the threaded ride height adjustment shock collar, the shock collar that goes in between the dual spring rates, and the shock bottom. So we're making sure that the front has the yellow springs. So these are the fronts because they've got the spacers on them. There we go, and we're just triple checking that. Yep, front only for the spacers. So now we've got the threaded shock collars. So we're going to put these on from the bottom and make sure that they're facing the correct direction. I'm just going to run them about halfway up just to start with, and then from there you can adjust them however you need for your ride height. Now just a note, the recommended, if you're going to be using your own shock oil, the recommended shock oil is I believe it's 30 weight. But you can use whichever, you know, once you're used to tuning the truck, knock yourself out and decide however way you want to do it. So that is the first set of shocks made. Nice and easy. Just going to be putting the pivot balls in place. And these are the rear with the green springs. Make sure they face the correct way. And you'll note that we've got some extra leftover E-clips just in case you do lose them. So now we're just going to gently press in the pivot balls. Again, from the side that has the mold flash. There we go. Make sure that they move freely and pivot like they should. The tops are a little bit tighter than the bottoms. And there we go. That's step 39 complete and your shocks fully assembled. Okay, so step 40, and that is opening bag F to create, assemble the drive shafts. So we've got the metal pieces in one bag and the plastic pieces separate. So these are the standard length drive shafts. If you're going to be altering the wheelbase of the truck, you do have a bunch of optional parts here, or additional parts as they're noted in the bag. These are the shorter drive shafts. So you'll note that there are marks on the ends of the drive shafts so that these can line up properly, but we're going to leave them separate for now because we will be putting screw bolts through to connect the metal hardware at the ends of the drive shafts. So we're going to open up the metal parts bag now. And we've got the pivots and all of the ball joints, the universal joints and everything. So we're going to need our some fresh thread lock compound and our grease again. So we're going to start, they're basically all the same pieces that go at each end. So there's 4 of everything. There's 4 screws, 4 pins, 4 pivots, 4 of these light metal pieces, and 4 of the ball joint pieces. So let's just make them all at once. Make sure when you're sticking this in that you've got, give a little spin so that everything gets coated. And you line up the hole in the pivot piece so that you can access it through the slot in the ball piece. And we're going to put a light coating of grease on this. Again, we're working with grease again, so make sure and have a rag handy. So now, let's see, we need to just line up the holes so that the cross pin can go through. And then we've got that one there, and we're going to be putting thread lock on the end of this. It's a 1.5 mil wrench, just a dab of thread lock straight up through the middle. There we go. So that's the first one done, and we're just going to carry through and do the rest. Now, one thing to note, the instructions do mention that the marks at the ends of the drive shafts should line up with the pin positions. So make sure and do that properly. You see that top spline is lined up with the pin positions. So bag G, we're going to be opening that up now. A lot more plastic parts in there. And let's see what we're going to need. Got shock towers, there's the skid plate which we're going to need. And the bumper, front and rear, there's battery tray pieces. We got the, there's the front drive shaft, or the center drive shaft, I should say. A bunch of hardware. More rock rail pieces. A couple more shock towers. And then some smaller plastic pieces. So we're going to get to all these in the next few steps. Okay, so step 43, we have laid out all of the pieces that we need for this step. Basically, we've got a bunch of 18 mil screws with button heads, which is important to note because there are some flathead screws mixed in here. There's also 20 and 15 mil screws. So make sure that you note which are which. So there's also 8 mil screws. So the really short ones, those are the 8 mil. We'll just be needing one for this step. And then we've got, I believe these are 15, and I believe those are 20. So we're not going to be needing those for this particular step. We will be needing 4 of these 18 mil long button head screws. Those will be going through these inner holes in the chassis rails after passing through the rock rail holders or mounts. And then through the skid plate and into these pieces, which have each the long lock nut pieces, lock nuts inserted into them. Now you'll note that there are 2 different lengths of lock nuts. The shorter blue lock nuts. There's only 3 of those, so we're not. We need 4 for this particular step, so don't use the blue ones. And so the first thing we're going to do is just gently press these lock nuts into place. If you can do it with your hands, great. If not, you can use adjustable pliers. If they go in just slightly off center, you can just use adjustable pliers, just very gently, and just press them in so that they're inserted into the plastic. You don't have to use a lot of force, we just want them to sit inside the hexagonal hole that's already molded in the plastic for them. Okay, so you'll note that this is the right side chassis rail, this is the left side chassis rail. The front has the gentle smooth curve, the rear has the flat section at the back, and that's where the battery tray is going to sit. Okay, now the skid plate, there's this oval section here. You can see the ridge there. There's a bit more of a space between these 2 holes and the little bump that's at the bottom. So this oval section and the space, those face to the left. So that's the left chassis rail. So now before we start bolting everything together, these just need to be installed, these little retainer pieces. So we need to make sure that this particular piece mounts on the left front bolt here. And all the other pieces fit into place. so that there's a little gap between for the rear links and then for the front link there. So we've got a 3-link front, 4-link rear, and this one isn't used as a link. Okay. Now I believe everything is ready, so we're just going to connect these through. So that's the left side bolts going into the nuts. Okay, and there we are. That's the rock rail mounts and the skid plate installed. And now the last plastic piece for this step is this little strange looking guy. And this one goes here on the right side and is held in place with an 8mm button head screw. Now, if you're not using the speed controller shelf and receiver box pieces, you can just leave that plastic piece off if you're going to be mounting them somewhere else. But we're building this as the instruction manual says, so we're leaving that in place. And that's step 43 complete. So step 44 is attaching the front chassis brace with all the electronics pieces and the front shock towers. So we need, there is a difference between the front and rear shock towers. So these are the rear shock towers, which we don't want for this particular step. And these are the fronts, which we do want. And they are symmetrical. So they will be going, first we're going to get this piece here. Now, of course, yours is going to have, as you're building it, you're going to have your motor and your servo installed, and actually all your electronics on this piece here. So we're going to flip this over so it looks just like the instruction manual. And slide the metal pieces into place, or use this little cutout that's in the left side chassis rail to help us just get it located. So you'll notice that the plastic brace here, it mounts up into a little cutout on the bottom of the speed controller shelf, and that's how it's going to look. So again, let's put this upside down so we're not mixed up. And we've got the shock towers. And so we've got two 12 mils and two 14 mils. The 12 mils are going to be going through the through the shock tower, through the chassis rail, and into the cross brace here. So you just need to make sure that you've got the holes lined up properly. So that they can go through. Maybe start that with a hand tool. just to get the location of the hole correct. And then now the thin lock nuts are going to hold the 14 mil screws in place. So those slot into position. You can use the power tool to drive it home. Okay, so that's one side installed. We've also got an 8 mil button head going into the speedo shelf. Okay, so now it's getting a bit more solid. So we've got the other shock tower. And the thin lock nut. So the thin lock nut will slide into place on the bottom of that cross brace. And then the 14 mil flathead screw and there we go. So that's the front end almost done. Make sure that the body mounts are positioned to the rear of the chassis, so they're closer to the skid plate than to the front end, because otherwise you're going to get your body mount markings just a bit off. So that is step 44. So step 45 is the next step, and that will be us attaching the drive shafts to the transfer case. So in our case, we've put them together, but that's just to keep them so nothing gets lost. So we've got these drive shafts, and basically they're going to be installed over these drive outputs. And we're going to be using the screw shafts. Obviously one on either side. And we're going to need the thread lock again and 1.5 mil screws. So on the drive shafts, both sides are threaded. Okay, so it's important to note in case you ever do need to do a trail repair or anything like that. And just slide them through and tighten down. And that's it. Let the thread lock dry. And they won't come out. Just line up the hole. Line up the hole, and there you go. Once you have it lined up, it just drops into place. Tighten, and you're done. That's step 45. Step 46, get your chassis back out, and this is where you make sure that you've installed the skid plate properly. If you haven't, you'll quickly find out, and because this has to line up pretty much straight, dead on. So this front center drive shaft, the dog bone, put a little grease on these pieces that are going to be making contact metal to metal. And then there you go. Give it a spin, make sure everything's working. And we like to line up the logo so that you can see it from the side. And then from the bottom, you just need 4 10mm flathead screws. Which are going to be these guys here. And you can double check that with the life-size drawing in the manual. Hold the transfer case in place and then just start installing. Again, we're doing the star method as usual. And there we go. That's the first, well, another piece of the drivetrain installed in the truck. Okay, so step 47. This should go pretty quick as well. We need the 8mm flathead screws, so the really short ones. Need the battery tray and the battery strap, and we're just going to show you how to install the strap for the round type batteries. Now if you're going to be using rectangular style batteries, like such as for lithium polymer, you basically just leave these curved pieces off. You just don't install them. It's very simple. And then we just need this funky looking screw with the threads only at one end, and that will go into here, and this acts as the hinge for the strap. And then to lock it in place, we've got this piece here. You'll note that the little inserts there go into the clip piece. And then we've got the short button head screws, 8mm button head screws, just to hold this in place. That's all you need for that, and then use one of the body clips to hold the strap down properly. So step 48 is of course going to be attaching this as the rear chassis brace and also the shock towers. So these are just going straight into the plastic. There's no lock nuts or anything. So we need, again, the 14 mil flathead screws. So we've got 2 there. And 2 there. And once again, note that the body mount hole faces to the center of the chassis. So there we are. That's the front and back braces installed, and step 48 complete. Next step is step 49, and that's where we're installing the bumper mounts, front and rear, and also the panhard mount, which is this funky looking aluminum piece. So this is our front bumper mount, and that will be going in place here. Note that this piece goes on the right side, and then the panhard mount hangs underneath facing to the back. So we've got the flathead 15 mil screws, and those will be going through the panhard mount, through the chassis rail, into the plastic bumper mount. So that's one side in, and then on the left side, we have a button head 10 mil screw, which, like all the other screw lengths, you can double check your eyesight and make sure that that is the same length with the life-size drawing. So there's the front bumper, feeling very solid now, and the rear bumper now. So 2 more 10 mil button head screws. And there we go. That is step 49 complete. Okay, now we are ready for step 50, where we have the front axle, and we're going to be installing the drive shaft and the lower links. So remember these 93.5 mil length links that we made in an earlier step. We're going to need 2 of these. And if you recall, way back at the beginning, we mentioned that a 2mm ball end wrench is quite handy, because if you have a normal wrench, it's quite difficult to get the correct angle on the screws going into the link connections or the link mounts. Now, if you don't have a ball end wrench, what might happen is you mess up the screws on these aluminum pieces by the screws going in a little crooked, or you could possibly mess up the heads of the screws where the hexes are. So to avoid that, what you can do is just temporarily remove the link mounts, and then install the links in place. And you make sure you use the correct length screw. So we have a 12mm screw. Remember, we have the life-size drawings. Just a bit of thread lock on them. And then reinstall the link mounts back in place. Now, you'll probably need to put a fresh bit of thread lock on the ends of the screws. But just a little bit. And there's the first one installed. So we'll just put the other one on real quick. And just little dabs of thread lock. And again, when you're putting these, if you're doing it this way, just make sure that you're seating them properly. And that's both links, and that they're also facing the correct direction. So that's how the front end should look. And now we're going to get the drive shaft and the screw shaft, and get some thread lock on these pieces, on the threads. We'll attach it from the bottom. The drive shafts have the holes are threaded on both sides, so you don't have to worry which direction those are facing. Okay, so there you go. And that's step 50 complete. 51 is installing the panhard link and the steering link, which connects to the servo. Now remember, on the steering link you've got a taller ball end, or taller link pivot ball, and a shorter pivot ball. The shorter pivot ball is the one that attaches to the actual axle. So we need the thin lock nut and a 12mm screw. and another 12 mil, and this is going to be going into metal, the aluminum link, so we're putting a bit of thread lock on it. So with the panhard link and the steering link installed, the last link to put in is that front upper link, which is this one here, the one that looks totally different from all the others. And I'm just going to get some thread lock on it, on the screw, and then just hand tighten that, and then finish it off with the driver. That's nice and tight. And there you go. There's all your links. So you've got your panhard link, your steering link, which connects to the servo, the upper link, which is the third link of the front suspension, drive shaft, and then your left and right links. And you'll note that we've arranged the logos and the writing on the links so that you can actually read them from outside the truck, so to speak. So extra pro looking. All right, so that is step 51 complete. So step 52 is we're going to be attaching all of this to the chassis. So again, we're going to flip the chassis over because that's how it's shown in the manual, just so we're following it to the letter. Now note that there's an exclamation mark on the drive shaft because you need to attach the drive shaft halves together. Wait, make sure this is correct, the correct way up. So let's take care of the links first. So note that the upper link will be connecting into this space here. So the 20 mil screw is going to go through the rock rail mount, through the chassis, through the pivot ball, and then into the plastic piece there. There we go. So that's the first link installed. The lower links will be going through the skid plate. Let me back that off just a bit. This is not too tight. And the other lower link. Go and just check how that feels. Make sure it's nice and smooth. Also make sure that when you turn it upside down, that the steering link is above the drive shaft and closest to the chassis rails, like so. Now we're going to attach the panhard link. This is another one where it's probably best if you have a ball head wrench, but it's not super critical in this case because it's not as extreme an angle as on the suspension mounts, on the link mounts. So you can get to it if you're careful like this, or you can go ahead and just take off the panhard mount. So that's nice and tight in there, and there's no damage to the screw head. So there we go. That's it, fully connected front and rear, and we've got the, of course, as you're building this, you've already put in the servo, so you can connect that to the servo arm. Okay, so the next step is this, after installing the drive shaft, is to attach the links. Now, just like the front end, in this case, again, we're going to take off the link mounts and attach the links separately, then reinstall the link mounts. So we'll just do that really quick. So we're trying to keep the screws together so we can just dip them at the same time in the thread lock. 12. Okay, so that's one side done. And again, we're trying to keep the writing on the links visible as you look at the truck from the outside, so to speak. So that's why we're making sure that everything lines up. Okay, so there we are. That's step 53 complete. So in step 54, we've got the upper links, which have the angled rod ends, and the M3 lock nut, and this very long cap head screw. So the angled pieces will be fitting this way, with the angles in the mount on the axle. And then the screw goes through the mount and through the pivot balls and then so that holds everything together. So we just need a 2.5 mil hex wrench. Make sure everything moves nice and smooth. So that's step 54. Step 55 is to get the chassis again, turn upside down, and we've got the making sure that the extreme angled ones are positioned closest to the chassis, putting the drive shaft in place, and then we've got just need to attach the links at the top. So we're going to need, we've got our two 20 mil screws and then our 15 mil screws there. So we're going to do the upper links first. And those take the 20 mil screws. And with the other side, just getting that screw in. Okay, and now attaching the lower links to the skid plate. All right, okay, so there we are. Apart from the shocks, we're getting there. So step 56 is to open bag H, which is the last bag to open. So in here we've got the front and rear body mounts and the rock rails. We have the additional parts, which we mentioned earlier, which is a optional rear bumper mount, some different upper link mounts, the very short drive shafts, and an axle mount for the servo. We have the body attachment hardware and a few more screws and hardware for attaching the wheels. Okay, let's get the shocks. Now remember, the fronts have the limiters. And so we've got the lower shock mounts are held in place with the 18 mil screws, and the uppers by the 12 mil. So we've got those separated out. Okay, so let's get attaching. So the front shocks are mounted, obviously there's only one mount on the bottom, and at the top they're mounted in the front hole. So we're going to need the thread lock again. Well, no, we won't, because we've got lock nuts. This is where you can use a pair of needle nose pliers to hold the lock nut, because you're not going to get the 5.5 box wrench in there. And the other front. Okay, so that's the front shocks installed. Rear shocks, same screws, and in the rearmost hole at the top. All right, so that is step 57 complete. All that's left now is the rock rails and the body mounts. So for the rock rails, or rock sliders, depending on what you want to call them. One for each side, obviously, and 2 screw shafts per side. This is step 58. So at the moment, we're just pushing them all the way in. So there we go, that's the rock rails installed. Definitely looking much more complete now. And now the body mounts. Of course, depending what you've got, these pieces connect together to make the rear mount for sport utility truck style trucks with a high back. So we'll go ahead and show that. No, it's over here. We'll go ahead and show how to install that, install them. And then if you are using a lower style of body, you can just use the standard height mounts. So we've got the body mount hardware. And at the front, you can, of course, if you are running a body that needs to be lowered, you can just cut the bottoms of the shock of the body mounts as much as you need. Now, if you're going to be using this, you need to remove these pieces here, the button head screws. And and use the flathead screws instead. So the tops go into the body mount as normal, and then the flathead screws go through the body mount, through the chassis rail, and into the bumper mount, or the bumper delete, which is what is currently installed. And then body clips to hold them in place, and then the straight body mounts fit into the tops like that, and then just make sure that they're even, and of course adjust them to fit whatever body that you're running. And that is it. That's the last step. So, hope you enjoyed that. Let us know how you are running your Venture SBK. And I hope you enjoyed building it along with us.